briefly in each of your cases, and Maria, let's start with you. A Thousand Cuts really dives into your incredible journalism with Rappler in the Philippines, your arrest by President Duterte on his orders, which is kind of retroactive law that claims that you were not doing journalism. But how do you, just give me a sense of how you believe you fit into the arc of history? I know, small.
I think we have tried, humanity as a whole has tried to protect humanity from the worst of human nature, right? But I think the biggest game changer, what is different about our time, is technology. And this is something I say over and over and over, right? Our weaknesses as individual people have been micro-targeted. Studies have been done to manipulate us, to bring out the worst of human nature, us against them, the polarization of society. This is built into our societies by design, and over 3 years. Actually, where it really went crazy was in 2015, when news was welcomed into Facebook, instant articles, right? And then we began to feel the impact globally in 2016. We in the Philippines were first. The election of Duterte in May. Then Brexit came a month later, and then you had the dominoes fall all the way through. I'd say just three sentences of why this is such a critical moment and why the technology is the accelerant to bringing out the worst in all of us. When a lie told 1,000,000 times becomes a fact, you have alternative realities, right? We've heard that phrase from different people all around the world. When you don't have facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. And without all these three, you don't have democracy, you don't have a working society.
Thank you. Masha, in your book, The Future is History, I was struck by, at least in my reading, that you think that some people really embrace and crave totalitarianism, that it is a safe space for them. And when you watch A Thousand Cuts, you see some of this desire for safety and simplicity in a way that requires that people be crushed in order to achieve that safety and simplicity. Can you just give me a sense of like how you view people's desires? Like, what do people actually want out of these times? And are those of us who support press freedoms and support human rights regardless of gender and sexual orientation, are we barking up the wrong tree?
There have been a few books that have enjoyed a resurgence since the Trump election, books that were written about totalitarianism when we first encountered it. And one of them has not been one that I think everyone should be reading. It's a small book and it's brilliant. It's Eric Fromm's Escape from Freedom. And thank you. It's an amazing book. I mean, it's also an amazing document because in the introduction he apologizes for writing it so hastily because he feels that the world is on the precipice. And the introduction is written in 1940. And then he talks about what he perceives as two freedoms, the two kinds of freedom. Freedom to and freedom from. And freedom from, we all want our parents to stop telling us what to do. And freedom to can be incredibly scary and burdensome. It's the freedom to invent yourself. It's the freedom to imagine the future, right? And his suggestion is that there are times in human history when there's such overwhelming anxiety about that future, that the burden of imagining it becomes unbearable. And then a critical mass of people want to hand over their agency to somebody whom he calls the magic helper, who promises to take them, also this term, to an imaginary past, to save them from this fearsome future. And I think that it's a fine balance between acknowledging that anxiety, which has perfectly valid roots. I mean, only an insane person wouldn't be anxious about the future now, right? And seeing the threats of handing over agency and asking for totalitarianism.
And so, Patrick, what do we do, and more specifically, what do you do? Just tell us a little bit about how you and OSF are processing this moment, and maybe you can talk about the big announcement that, of the new university.
I'm happy to do that, but can I just take a second to geek out about being on a panel?
I know.
And one has to be impressed with Maria's humility. Of course, she won't place herself in the stream of history, but the rest of us will. And we recognize that the fight that you have taken up, Maria, is an ancient fight, because as Farai suggested, there's nothing new about this contestation of ideas between would-be authoritarians and those of us who are championing democracy and inclusion. And you're in the stream of that fight. We all appreciate you and applaud you for it. So thank you so much for that. I'll answer your question, and I'll get to this point about our exciting $1 billion announcement that we made amongst the Illuminati in the snow. But I'm really struck by what Masha said in the book that she referenced. And of course, there is nothing new here, right? Like Plato, who all of our children study, who's held up as somebody who is articulating the virtues of republic and democracy, was really putting, kind of a screen on authoritarianism, right? Because if you read the Republic closely enough, you appreciate that there's a way that Plato was suggesting that peace and order is the ideal role of government, ideal role of the Republic, and peace and order is very distinguishable from the question of justice, right? And that tension persists to this day, but is particularly amplified, as Maria suggested, by the tools of ignorance that dominate our lives now. We know that those of us who have worked in politics and who've tried to elect people understand that all politics runs through the filter of, in this age of seduction especially, runs through the filter of fear or hope. Some of us try to organize from a place of hope, but others know how to powerfully exploit fear, and these new tools enable you to do that. Masha, I used to be a union organizer, and in my union we had a lot of home care workers and nurses, and Maria, many of them were Filipino nurses in the U.S., and after the rise of Duterte, I found myself in a conversation with some of my old union activists, and there were some Filipino sisters in that conversation, and I was saying all manner of critical things about Duterte, and they stopped me, and they said, Patrick, things are really rough. The drug crisis has spiraled out of control. You and people like you are well-intentioned, but you don't really get it. We are fearful in our communities and for our families. And this guy has a track record when he was mayor of clamping down on this, and we think that he's going to do the right thing now. So I experienced in real time that in this moment where they were prepared to suspend issues of justice to put peace and security as the primary mode of organizing themselves and their politics. And it goes back to Masha's frame, which is really about this question of whether or not there's a notion in our democracies of individual responsibility, or if we're prepared to suspend our complete responsibility to the authoritarian, to the president, to the prime minister, etc. So we're thrilled by Georgia's announcement in Davos of $1 million to create the Open Society University.
You want to be off that million.
Did I say million?
You did.
$1 billion. So $1 billion. See, I have my pockets aren't as deep as Georgia's. So sometimes my officials say $1 billion to seed the Open Society University network. I think everyone here is probably familiar with the struggles of the Central European University that was basically chased out of Hungary by Viktor Orban, again, somebody elected in a democratic space with authoritarian values. And it's interesting, though, as Viktor Orban launched his campaign against CEU, one of the first and most pronounced things that he did was to ban gender studies, which made it impossible for CEU to operate with integrity in that space. A real relationship between gender studies and authoritarian instincts. But this $1 billion is creating a network between institutions like Central European University, which is now going to Vienna, Bard College in New York, Arizona State University, which pioneers online learning, and a number of critical institutions in the global south. And it's going to be an ever-expanding network. And the intention here is to focus scholarship expressly on open society values, particularly this question of information democracy, the challenge of climate action, and the pressures it's going to put on public services and resources that authoritarians will exploit, and a general sense of academic freedom. So we'll lift up within it a program to resource scholars who are in exile, who'll be able to bring their learning to a new generation of young scholars who will become future government leaders, future heads of NGOs, and future civil society activists.
That's really exciting. It's a very concrete as well as ambitious and well-funded response to our times. I'm gonna ask both of you about responses to our times, but since Patrick mentioned it, I did want to go to gender. I mean, one of the things in watching both 1,000 Cuts and Welcome to Chechnya was that it was very clear that there's a profound psychic threat that authoritarians perceive from gender freedom, physical freedom, and in people's ability to govern their own gender orientation, sexual orientation, and reproductive rights. And for Rappler, throughout the film, and many of your colleagues are here, and we really applaud them.
I've never seen all of us in one shot, the 3 founders of Rappler, plus the reporter who President Duterte towered over and tried to bully, Pia Renata, and Rambo, who you will see in the film also. It's rare for us to all be out. It's not an
Not everyone can stand it without a camera. Thank you.
This is why we can do what we
Yes.
do. Rappler is 63% women, and the median age is 23 years old. It's crazy, right?
We've got a bunch of 7-year-olds. There's a whole sequence in the movie where you're being threatened with rape and murder through, the chain of intimidation from the president that goes to a bunch of trolls who are very highly organized. And it's just extremely moving to watch how steady you are. But I don't take for granted those threats. How do you process this, and why do you think gender is so pivotal?
So first, jumping off of what Patrick said, on social media, lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts, right? Facts are really boring. We spend our entire careers learning to make them interesting, so you will read about the facts, right? And so here are these people, and we know who they are, these networks of disinformation that are using the tools of technology to lie. And what we've seen in our country is it took less than 6 months for our institutions to collapse. That's one. Number 2, our data. How do I deal with the threats? Because I see the data. We're alpha partners of Facebook. It's partly our fault that Facebook, 100% of Filipinos on the internet in the Philippines are on Facebook. Facebook is our internet. And we, for the 4th year running, Filipinos spend the most time on social media globally. So Chris Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblowers, called our country the Petri dish and said that the Philippines is, along with Nigeria, for example, are the countries where Cambridge Analytica tested these tactics of mass manipulation, and then if they worked, they ported them over to the United States and Europe. So we're literally the guinea pigs for you guys. And then I think the third part is, I'm 56 years old. Look at Pia. Pia, stand up. Pia Renata. Look at this young reporter, right? Pia is a fraction of my age, and the kind of targeting that I've gotten, she's gotten it worse. And to see the courage of our young reporters is incredible. So, we know this is manufactured. We know this is artificial, and we know we need to fight it because it is used by populist, authoritarian leaders, not only to get elected, but to tear down democracies. So, as long as we hold the line, as long as we hold the line, all it takes is one. Remember that psychological study? If one person in the room questions the majority, it makes everyone think. So that's the reason why, because we have the data. So we gotta go back. You know, this is, I think 2020 is a transformative year. It will help. I read Masha's book, right, and her, what's happened in Russia is global now. I mean, we can find the links from the Philippine disinformation networks after the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing in 2018 released the data of the IRA, the Internet Research Agency. We found the bottom-up links from the Philippines. So you have a nervous system going across the world that is linking vertically with each of the, and the countries in the global south are far more vulnerable than yours because our institutions are weak. The yearning for an authoritarian style leader, it's been less than 35 years since the People Power Revolt pushed out Ferdinand Marcos after 21 years. Our country had that, right? So there's a lot at stake for us. I think it's an existential moment. Rappler got through that. We're still alive 3 years in, right? But it's an existential moment for news groups because we're getting attacked on two fronts. Credibility by the platforms, that's where the attacks are happening. The first people attacked in the Philippines were the journalists, and we're getting attacked in the business model. Advertising, 85% of the advertising in many countries go directly to the technology giants. So it's a tough time to tell truth to power, but at no other time has it been more important to uphold that mission. And I think that's the power of Rappler, and that's why we're calm.
Yeah. I would just if you could give me a quick answer. There were some fascinating women in this. No. I mean, but I'm just curious. Two women that were not part of the Rappler team really stood out to me. One is named Mocha Uson, who's like this dancer and entertainer who also does kind of super weaponized social media for the president. And then the other was a candidate from Otso Derecho, which is a political party. And those two women, they both struck me as very powerful, very different. And how do you think gender is playing into the Philippines' quest for identity?
Our data shows on the online attacks that women are attacked at least 10 times more than men. So that's like and the gendered attacks are very sexual, they're sexualized. So we have a senator, Laila de Lima, who's been in prison, and she's coming up on her third year in prison, right? She's coming up on her third year in prison without really a trial of any sort. It's funny that people who are fighting are also women. I think we've taken, the president has said things like, when a missionary, an Australian missionary was raped and killed, he said, the mayor should have been first. He said he should have been first to rape her. He has said things that should never be said publicly, but this has also been part of the research Cambridge Analytica has done. The fact that he says these things unleashes in others who were taught to be politically correct, unleash that same kind of thing. So what are we facing? I think a throwback to the Dark Ages. The Philippines has had 2 women presidents. And yet, now, we're going back to the Dark Ages in terms of the kinds of attacks I've had to deal with. I've never dealt with them in my entire career. This is my 34th year. Actually, the guy who hired me for CNN, Eastern Jordan, is here also. This is a strange time. So it is, I think, the women are the ones fighting back because the women are the ones who have most to lose.
Welcome to Chechnya, parts of it were just so, I mean, all of it was disturbing, but parts of it were so viscerally disturbing. People describing how they were tortured, people describing how other people were tortured for being LGBTQ. One of the people, there's a sort of group of people who work on an incredible human rights rescue of people threatened, and one of them said, Putin uses homophobia and, quote, traditional values, end quote, as tools to consolidate his power. And I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but the president of Chechnya, Kalyryov, thank you, just takes it all to the extreme. It happened under Stalin and Hitler. And that really, that whole arc of history thing, but you know, I really loved your piece in the New Yorker. I love all your pieces, but your piece where you talked about the Supreme Court case over LGBTQ rights in America, and yourself being non-binary, and our need to hyper-classify and put people in boxes. Tell us a little bit about Welcome to Chechnya and what people are facing there, and also, you know, lest we feel we're on our high horse, how are we doing here in the U.S.?
Okay, so a couple of small questions here.
Yes.
So Welcome to Chechnya, which doesn't come out until tomorrow, so I assume almost no one has seen it here. It's a film. It began with a story that I did for the New Yorker in May 2017 about the rescue efforts to help gay men in Chechnya who are being hunted down, jailed, and either killed in jail or released into their family's custody for their families to kill. And what was absolutely extraordinary when I went to Moscow to report it was that I found that in just 2 months since the story first started coming out of Chechnya, this group of very disparate activists in both Moscow and St. Petersburg had created a system for extricating people from Chechnya. And they were, you know, it was really by the seat of their pants at first. They were, they sort of put out a call on social media, contact us if you need help, and then they would get people bus tickets, or they would get them a plane ticket, and they would pick them up, and they, well, now what do we do with them? Surely we're going to be able to get a visa to take them to be able to help them to leave Russia. Not so fast. All these foreign embassies were saying, you know, we're happy to help you in your efforts, but you know, we don't issue visas. Eventually, they were able to set up some pipelines to Canada, to France, to a couple of other European countries. But really, I mean, that effort is still ongoing. But this group, this ad hoc group of activists, has been able to extricate so far over 150 people, right, from these. You know, I just can't describe how dangerous these circumstances are for people, and there are many layers to them because the men who are sort of as horrible as their situation is are visible and have some agency and can leave the country without, for example, getting their relatives' permission. And then there are the women who the same thing is happening to, who are invisible and can't leave the country, can't leave Chechnya without, you know, asking their older brother or their father if they can leave home. And then there are the activists in other parts of Russia who are helping them. Some of them have been exposed and have had to go into exile. And then there's one extraordinarily brave man who's sort of the protagonist of our movie, who decided to come out, show his face, name his name, and try to take the Russian government to court over this state-sanctioned purging and violence against gay men. And the price of his bravery has also been to go into exile. Right? So it's a story. It's a movie about extraordinary bravery and extraordinary heartbreak because, you know, there's the loss of exile. I think really comes across in this film, and it's profound. So why are gay men and lesbians being targeted in Chechnya? Well, because it is an extreme expression of Putin's anti-gay politics, and anti-gay politics has been a centerpiece of Kremlin politics since the current crackdown began in 2012. So, is anybody here familiar with the term gender ideology? So 1%. It's huge, right? I mean, around the world, there's actually a huge international movement, and it really is an international movement. Some people think that it's a Russian movement. Some people think it's Americans exporting hate. It's not, unfortunately. It's really and truly an international movement, a meeting of the minds across the world with this driving idea that there is a plot to destroy the family and make white people extinct by promoting gender ideology, right? Which is this sort of nebulous. Sometimes it's seen as this idea that gender is a social construction. Sometimes it's seen more broadly as women's rights. Sometimes it's also seen as LGBT rights. All of this kind of falls under the umbrella of gender ideology. And one way to explain it, I think, is to say this is the most recent social change we've seen around the world. It is a very convenient place and group of people to pin our anxieties on. So Putin's message is, you want things to go back to the way they were when you were comfortable? We just have to get rid of queer people, right? We get to stand in for everything that has happened that makes people scared and uncomfortable. Another way I think to look at it, and to an extent it's true in this country too, I think Trump's message is very much, I'm reversing social change. I'm taking you back to the imaginary past. Which is why, even though he draped himself in a rainbow flag during the campaign, it was inevitable that under him the Justice Department would immediately reverse its stand on LGBT rights, and in particular, of course, trans rights. And another way I think to look at it is again in the sort of framework of the kind of freedom that scares us. Questioning the hierarchy of the heterosexual family, questioning the framework of the heterosexual family, questioning the immutability of biological sex, all of these things place us in a kind of place of uncertainty. And it's terrifying. We just want things to be clear and the way they always were, and we want everybody to be identifiable, which is, for example, why I think most of the hate mail I get now, in some way or another, asks the question, are you a man or a woman? Because at least that would make me somehow a little bit less scary, right? And it's like, the challenge that I personally pose is that I'm kind of not either, right? So, and to bring us back to to here and to the Supreme Court hearing that you referred to. So, the Supreme Court is about to rule on the most consequential LGBTQ rights case ever. Right? It's 3 lawsuits that have been combined into a single case, 2 sexual orientation discrimination in the workplace cases, and 1 trans discrimination on the basis of transgender status. And I think it's more consequential than marriage equality. Not everyone wants to get married. Not everyone has the opportunity to get married. Pretty much all of us have to work, right? And there's a very real possibility, probably probability, that the Supreme Court will license discrimination against people on the basis of sexual orientation and transgender status. This will be the law of the land for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Masha, for that bracing analysis.
People weren't sure if they should applaud or like.
Yeah, I know, people are like, yeah, exactly like I said, handing out the sedatives in the beginning. Patrick, it strikes me that you have so much power, but also, like all of us, you can't control everything. How do you process the responsibility that you have and that you've taken on and you've chosen by leading this incredible organization? I mean, what I'm trying to get at is we all have decisions to make. Some of us have very private decisions, like how do we welcome or embrace different people in our communities. You have tons of public, high-impact decisions. Tell us about how you think. How do you think at this time about making decisions? And maybe if you choose to give us a window into some decision you had to make about this current era of what I see as a global rise in authoritarianism.
Sure. So let me first push back against the premise. I actually think that I have very little power. I think that our organization has an overstated, radically exaggerated power and influence. And there's a relationship between the way open society is projected as a power and influencer and the fact that our chairman and founder is Jewish. There's a relationship between those things because the same projection is not made about the Gates Foundation, despite the fact that they're actually they have more resources than we do. So I just want to push back against that if I could. And George announced the $1 billion for the creation of OSIN. I think that more than that is spent on public transportation in the city that I live in. So just to put these things into some perspective. But I will say that this is a revolutionary time that we live in. It's a radical time that we live in, and we should recognize that as a consequence of that, the norms don't apply, the old rules don't apply, and that should force us all of us, to take up really difficult choices and to figure out how we are going to best focus for impact in this moment. When George and so many of my colleagues launched the Open Society Foundations, plural, around the world some 30 years ago, they have historic wins in their back. In the U.S., there was a bipartisan notion that human rights was the business of our foreign policy. Some of us are old enough to remember that. There was this kind of old-fashioned bipartisan sense of that. That is long since gone. We've paid a lot of attention here, or not a lot, but some attention to Russia and its influence. But we should speak about the rise of China and the importance of China in this moment, particularly as we think about this age of surveillance that we live in. And you think about nation-client states like Ecuador, Pakistan, and Nigeria that have a unique relationship with China and the way they're taking up the modes of that surveillance in their societies. So as I consider things like that, the challenge of climate, as I said, which is going to put considerable pressure on public resources. And when we think about the very notion of the attraction of authoritarianism within democratic spaces, I think it compels us to make some shifts in our grant making inside of our organization and to realize that while we may put a premium on kind of pluralism, that may not be the best approach in organizing and sorting through strategies that can help Maria Ressa and journalists like Carlos Chamorro in Nicaragua push back in these times. So for me, the last year or so has been moving from one incredibly difficult choice to another. Masha, God, there's so much that both Maria and Masha said before that I want to take up in response to this. And as you mentioned, the place that we're in right now and not holding ourselves up as virtuous pilgrims, I want to stand up as the example, the interaction that the U.S. Secretary of State, a gentleman by the name of Mike Pompeo, had with an NPR reporter just 48 hours ago, where she asked him what in any other era, any administration would be considered a routine question by a reporter about the Ukraine. And he, in a very chilling way, just pounced on her, intimidated her, because she dared to ask a question on behalf of all of us. Hannah Arendt wrote that in the darkest of times, we still should have some expectation of illumination, but authoritarians rely on the erasure of that expectation, the entire erasure of that expectation. Authoritarianism relies on a kind of nostalgia that Masha noted, but it's a nostalgia that is rooted in our own political imaginations. So, Farai, I'll tell you that as the head of our foundation, when I consider the question of political imagination and social policy, in an unapologetic way, I go everywhere and I say that the Open Society Foundation is a political philanthropy. Because if you are in the business of protecting the rights of the most marginalized communities in the world, if you're in the business of holding governments to account, you are in the business of politics. Nonpartisan politics, yes, but politics, and we should not allow authoritarians to erase our expectation of illumination in that space. So, this panel is called Speaking Truth to Power, which is one of my least favorite phrases as a former organizer. I've never wanted to speak truth to power. I've always wanted to organize people who are disenfranchised to actually have power. Speak truth to power and try to grow power. So right now, in our grant making, I'm looking for ways that we can, in a way, erase the hand of philanthropy and move larger resources, much more significant resources, into ways that allow and enable grassroots movements to take up their own agency and voice. All of us, those of you who are here in philanthropy, can we please get out of this portfolio business where we're handing out these piddling grants to organizations year in and year out. Let's move towards more multi-year funding that considers decades-long strategies. So that's what folks creating now and really sorry to lecture.
No, this is great. I'm going to come to you in a second, but I had a follow-up for Patrick. And on the process of grant making, someone said, regarding racial inequities in grant making, let's treat organizations run by people of color the way that we've historically treated white-led organizations, which is to fund them and treat them as thought leaders and thought partners. And that's a shift that is happening slowly, but happening in philanthropy. But just quickly, and I know this is not a quick question, but I'm going to throw it out there. I've been having a lot of conversations with people about, in the U.S., we obviously have our own authoritarianism. And I've just been reading all this social research on basic, behavioral economics and how people think. And so one of the things that's really in my mind is that America's struggle with, attractions to the past, this kind of mythic past, are almost always rooted in race. And right now in America, people of color are more optimistic than white people, even though white people basically have 10 times as much net wealth. That said, there are many white Americans who are having the deaths of despair, etc. So it certainly is something where I feel like it makes it much harder to even talk about a co-created future amongst people in our country unless we deal with the intersection of race and class. But these are treacherous waters that we've been swimming in for, 400 years, since before this country was formally founded. How does that figure into your work and your assessment of the chess sport?
God, I'm supposed to answer that
I'm sorry. The question was longer than the answer.
So I'll answer quickly, and I'll take up the previous question in my response as well. So, people like, I try not to say his name, because it's like,
He shall not be named.
It's like Voldemort, but the current occupant of the White House relies on the big lie. Like authoritarians, they rely on the big lie. And unfortunately for us, we have been the big lie in America since its inception, right? There's always been some sense that somehow we were the problem to be solved, and we know that in the most difficult economic times in this country, there's always, and I can say this about my former union brethren who are culpable in this. There's always a way that there's a competition of the working amongst the working class that's lifted up, and we are more often than not on the bottom rail of that competition. So what Donald Trump is, the damn name. So what he's doing is not dissimilar to what we have seen in the period between World War I and World War II, for instance, in so many countries around the world. The big lie is a substitution for facts, and it helps you move from a pluralistic media culture into a monoculture, right, where one sense of simplistic solutions can be taken up. And we need to recognize that as folks who are in the minority community, and we have to lift up our radical truth in a way that allows for the opportunity for solidarity, the opportunity for solidarity, right? So language is important, and so we have to understand that as we litigate our issues, we have to take up an idiom that's going to open that door, that opportunity for a bit. You asked me before about how I consider my opportunity and the power that I hold. There's a fantastic article that Masha wrote, it was like last month, about a young Russian student who was on trial, Yegor Zubov, who was facing the judge and was awaiting the verdict. And in his testimony, which you used for your column, he said that even in that dark moment, he was going to endeavor to have joy about the challenges that he faced because of the opportunity that he had to defend a set of values that he held dear. So every day in my role, I'm endeavoring to take up some sense of joy that our work is more needed now than ever before, and some joy in knowing that the Maria Resses of this world can get a little bit of wind in their back if we're smarter and if we have the courage of their convictions.
That's great. Yeah, I also have been struck by, we've gotten to meet several times, and of course I've been following your career, but you have an irrepressible joy. And in this film, we learn a bit more about you, that you're what is now called a third culture kid who's grew up partly in the U.S. And I know you had something to say, so you can say whatever you want, but also what gives you joy and what keeps it in your heart?
Mike, thank you. Well, first, from what Patrick said, right? Part of the reason that OSF and George Soros has outsized impact is because you are targeted by disinformation networks. You are the boogeyman, right? You are the them. It's us against them, and you are the devil. You're the devil. I have never seen anything like this from our data. The way, Filipinos didn't know who George Soros was, and all of a sudden he's the devil. And then the kind of targeting, and I'll go back to that again, I feel like a broken record, but you really have, if you don't live on social media, you don't feel it. If you haven't gotten 90 hate messages per hour, you don't know how bad it can get, right? But in the attacks, both against Rappler, Pia, OSF, George Soros, not OSF, they don't quite use OSF as much, but it truly makes a mythic creature of a man who has fought for democracy, because in the same way that the journalists were first targeted for attack, you break it down so anyone who tries to fight back loses credibility. I think that's the first one. What gives me joy? Oh my God, right now. Look, I see it. My sisters are also here. I feel like I'm saying, it is, I feel like we went to the gym. I lifted all the weights my entire career has led us to this moment. And this moment is critical for all of us. And I have great faith that the values haven't changed. And that we as in anyone who believes in the goodness of human nature, in a meritocratic society, all of us on the stage, right? I don't think, I'll go back one last to the way social media was used. Cambridge Analytica, the countries that had the most number of compromised Facebook accounts was the United States. The Philippines was number 2. And they targeted white men who were afraid and made you more afraid, right? They targeted people who are more prone to believe a conspiracy theory. They pounded a rift. Leaders would normally want to close the rifts in society, but they pounded it wide open. We saw this in the United States, we saw this in the Philippines. I've never seen a time like this. And I think that's part of the reason. It is one of those moments where we need every sector of society to come together to say this is not acceptable and to find a way forward. Strangely, I wish we weren't. Ramona spent a year and a half with us. I wish we weren't here. But the fact that we are here means that we have to be the best that we can be.
It is a time that I think in some ways makes you more yourself if you choose to be. And Masha, I've started recently reading The Bell, which is, this investigative journalism. It's a weekly newsletter in English. I think it's once or twice a day in Russian, which I don't read. And they just had a recent email kind of with like advanced criminology, like who's this person, where did they come from, why do they have this role? And I'm really trying to like brief up on what's going on in Russia. I had a couple of friends in college who were Soviet studies majors, and I was like, oh my gosh, the Cold War is ending. What kind of fool pursuit is this? I mean, like, if you want to do Russian languages and literature, is great, but like, political studies about Russia, irrelevant. I was wrong. And it just lets me know none of us are separate. So what do we need to know about Russia? Okay, table that, that's another book. How do we make sense of the funnel of information we need to know about? And maybe give us a little more context on how we can look at Russia, Chechnya, those of us who aren't very familiar, and where to start. First of all, with your books.
First of all, what?
Your books. I mean,
yes, I highly recommend. But actually, I'm going to push back against that question a little bit.
Please.
Because I think if I'm hearing it correctly, there's an implication in it that if we understand Vladimir Putin's master plan, we will understand what happened here. And
or maybe more
I have terrible news. He does not have a master plan. What happened here, and is continuing to happen here. And I actually think that we have lost a lot of ground, a lot of words and sort of intellectual power to obsessing about Russia over the last few years, rather than thinking about what actually happened here. Americans elected Donald Trump, right? And we still haven't come face to face with that really terrible truth, right? And we really don't have a lot of time to think about that and stop thinking about Russia quite so much.
You've made that point, before, and in text, and we've had some conversations, and I find it so valuable because a lot of my life, I spent about 25 years doing field reporting, and including face-to-face and phone interviews with white nationalists, and had a lot of conversations. And one of the things that, white nationalism has been a part of everything from the so-called Indian Wars and the, death and genocide around indigenous Americans to, basically everything. And so one guy who I spent a lot of time talking to was basically saying, you get it, because I recognized that there was an ideological component to white nationalism and supremacy aside from money. Everyone wants to say, oh, if we only just, gave poor white people more money. It's like, there are white nationalists, who are as rich as Steve Bannon and richer, and ones that are poor and ones that are middle class. And I think that your point not to I wasn't trying to sort of say, blaming the election on Russians, but more in a time of limited, just time is limited. How much do we need to understand each other's struggles? That's a struggle for me. So I tend to go deep on the U.S., but then I'm like, oh, wait, there's all these other things going on, and they all tie together. How do you process information? I know it's a weird question, but how do you process information to make sense of things?
How do I process information? Poorly, most of the time. I don't have enough time, and there's too much information. But there's an odd thing, right? Which is that somehow my life has prepared me for the work I'm doing now, which is probably true of many careers, but it just so happened that I spent 20 years working in Russia. I was born there, I came here as a teenager, then I went back as a correspondent and stayed for more than 20 years. And then had to leave again, and came here in 2013. Came back to the United States at the end of 2013. After having reported on Putinism for most of the time that I was working as a journalist in Russia. And so I feel like I have a special pair of glasses. Like, it's not, I'm not seeing anything that other people aren't seeing. I can just see I can pick it out of the fog a little bit better. I am still in the fog and the dim like the rest of us are, right? I mean, that's, and I think if anything, that what I have learned from living in a place where the regime is mounting an ongoing attack on truth, it's that sense of living in mush, right? It's like, wait, this was just coming into focus, how can I hold on to it? But you keep losing hold of it. And so I think my experience tells me that's precious, right? I try to I'm lucky enough to have the best job in the world. I actually get to put some of that down on the screen. And that helps, right? It helps to focus my thoughts. But I also, I think I'm really awake to this possibility of just drowning and, being descending further and further into this mushiness of reality.
Yeah,
Mentioning on that action, if I could there is a nostalgia politics, isn't there, that connects and unites Putin to Trump, to Salvini, to Orban, etc., to Duterte. We could go on and on that. But just something about the question and the U.S., if I could just challenge it just a bit. Now, as somebody who had the good fortune or the misfortune to work on every presidential campaign in the U.S. From 1988 through 2012, I was in Africa and not responsible in 2016. But where I've worked on all those campaigns, I understand the power of the racial narrative in our political discourse, right? Some of us remember when Ronald Reagan showed up in Philadelphia, Mississippi, talking about states' rights in that 1980 campaign, and we understood what it meant back then in America, right? So what the Morning in America really was in 1980. And there's been a thread of that in all of our politics. This current president just has this ability to move beyond the dog whistle to the bullhorn, right? To exploit that racial narrative, right? But I don't want us, if I could, right? I don't want it to, I think we shouldn't make the false binary choice here of a politics that is exploited through race or a politics that is neglectful of economic inclusion. Because I think there's a lot of both, and there's a lot that holds those two things together. And the truth of it is that following the global downturn, the Great Recession of 2007 and 2008, there is an anxiety that took hold, cross borders, that playing out in our current politics, and that has made the strong man that much more compelling, that much more attractive. I will never forget watching conversations, focus group conversations of voters who were going into the booth in 2016 in the New Hampshire primary contest, and they were debating whether or not they were going to support this current president or Bernie Sanders. And I kept asking myself, what's the, because New Hampshire is a place where you can declare the last woman which primary you're going to play in. And I thought, what is it that is similar about these two candidates? It was those candidates who were lifting up this notion that the system, the economic system, is rigged against you, right? Which is the truth. And both of those candidates, in their own unique way, were pushing back against liberal economic orthodoxy. And I think that we do a disservice to this conversation that we're having today if we focus exclusively on the exploitations and the strength of the authoritarians and the would-be authoritarians, and if we under-examine the failures of liberal democracy, particularly around the question of economic inclusion, how it drives this moment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I said to some, friends of mine and associates of mine who are very wealthy, I believe that wealth inequality is an existential threat to humanity's climate crisis, because there is very little, basically the feeling that what you have will be snatched and nothing will come to replace it makes people kind of cranky and prone to their worst, lowest, basest desires. But, just to return to something from the film, there was a moment where a woman stands up in the film, I'm guessing in her 60s, but who knows, and who's like, I feel safe, my retirement money went up, why should I be hot and bothered about what President Duterte is saying about the press? And you give her a great answer, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more of what you said to her and kind of how you relate to someone like that.
I'm sorry to bring you back to social media again, but
No, that's okay.
But I'll take what Patrick said, which was, think about social media for every single one of us in the room, right? There's a devil and an angel. You know that old cartoon? You have an angel, your good side, and then there's the devil egging you on, saying, you better take it away from that person, otherwise you're going to be left with nothing, right? That's precisely what the micro-targeting is doing to the most vulnerable sectors who are prone to that messaging. This is the kind of testing that was done on social media. So imagine 250 million Americans having to go through it, 100 million Filipinos. That's what's happening. The devil on the shoulder has gotten further with all of us. So it doesn't even matter what the reality is, because when you're pounded to paranoia and conspiracy theories and anger, facts, reality doesn't matter. You are angry and you are more prone to be irrational. So that wasn't the answer I gave to the woman, but I think you do not, I think many people underestimate the impact of social media, and the studies are there. It's in the Mueller report, right? It's there, but we keep anchored in the real world thinking that this is the only thing that matters. We are being manipulated. For this woman and the overseas Filipino worker, the nurses, the targeting is so specific that I've never seen a polarization of society in the Philippines in the 30 some odd years I've been reporting as I have now. And part of the reason she did respond this way was because her life is okay, and that's the messaging she was getting. The nurses in the campaign, in a 3-month campaign period, the drug war went from number 8 to number 1 by constant messaging, right? So, how do you solve this? A very easy way to solve this is to hold the groups that are manipulating us to account. They should not be getting away with impunity. And that includes the American social media platforms who enable this kind of thing, this kind of manipulation. I guess the last point on this is, I think that the way the world, the big shift from our time, and I'll say ours also, Masha, I think, the big shift from that reporting was the turnaround of the information ecosystem. It went from kind of being able to say top down, where the gatekeepers were doing their jobs and we were all debating facts, to granular bottom up, where no one knows what everyone has their own individual reality. And that needs to stop. And we can stop that, right? Russia is I think they were just the first to take social media, atomize it, and manipulate. They were the first to use it in the military doctrine. But lots of other countries are there. We're seeing China coming into the Philippines as well. Did I answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. No, you absolutely did. But I guess, and this is not a question, it's just a reminiscence or a thought, that I do think that basically the weaponization of work, in the sense that workers are not profiting from their increased productivity. There's been a stagnation in wages, higher economic insecurity. It does fit very much hand in glove with all of the different levels of dehumanization. And so, Masha, where do you see the opportunities? Obviously it's wonderful in Welcome to Chechnya, you have this crusading band of saviors. But that will not change the playing field. How do you think the playing field changes? Where are the levers?
I actually want to pick up where Patrick left off because I
I'm
think
a
that-
self-directed panel. I'm not mad at it. Go for it.
to answer your question.
Oh, no, you don't have to. I mean, that's
But it is. No, I just want to point out that that observation that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were offering a response to, and it's a response to a question that other candidates weren't even addressing, right? And that I think that has changed some, and I think that's where I see the opportunity. I think that we're coming closer, not close enough, and not fast enough to the understanding that we need to recreate politics, right? Not like change politics, but admit that we don't have politics in this country, right? That and by politics, I don't mean going to the voting booth. I mean a conversation about how we live together in the city, in the state, in the country, in the world, right, on this planet. We're not having that conversation, right? We're not having that conversation in debates. We're not having that conversation in the media. We're doing a disservice to the possibility of that conversation every time we sort the Democratic primary field into the left and the centrist or the progressives and the moderates, right? That's not what it's about. And I'm really afraid that we're not going to be able to start this conversation fast enough. And I think a lot of the responsibility for that inability rests with my field, with the legacy media, right? We're not doing our job in that. We haven't learned from the 2016 campaign. We continue to do horse race coverage of the campaign, and what adjustments there have been minor and inconsequential. But at the same time, in spite of that, certainly in the midterms of 2018, we saw candidates emerge who I think were, again, portrayed in the media, analyzed in the media in all sorts of wrong ways, but who are people who are talking, who are starting this conversation, and who are speaking not to a stock list of questions, but to people's felt anxieties and experiences.
We're going to go in a couple of minutes to questions, so get yours ready, and when question time comes, there will be a microphone. Do not start until the microphone comes to you. I just wanted to mention a couple of things that might be interesting to folks here. I definitely think a lot about how journalism is not, a lot of it is what I call intellectual entertainment. Like, it's cool to know if you like all the name dropping and who was at what Washington cocktail party, but it's not really actually presenting us with what we need to know. But a couple of things that I'm really inspired by in journalism. One is City Bureau's work with a program called Documenters, where they train and pay citizen journalists to cover local meetings and things like that. And they have a whole manifesto about, our journalism is designed to give people civic power. It is not, intellectual entertainment. This is a lever of power. And another one is the work of Press On, a Southern movement journalism organization, and has two great leaders, one of whom is Louis Raven Wallace, who was fired for basically calling BS on a lot of contemporary journalism, and he has a wonderful book, The View from Somewhere, challenging orthodoxies, false orthodoxies about journalistic objectivity. He also happens to be transgender and talks about, just really wonderful deep stuff. So there is inspiration. I'm going to go to Patrick and ask what inspires you. And I'm going to run the gamut and then go to questions. What's inspiring you?
That's easy for me right now, but I wish that the greatest sin of journalism was entertainment. I think that the greatest sin, and I'll call out the New York Times in particular on this, is this false equivalency.
Yes.
That they are always, that's the
Both sidesism.
Oh,
It's
a
the
great
religion.
sin. But what inspires me right now, if I had to lift up an example, I would lift up the example of the work of Richard Laurent and his colleagues in an organization that he started after the Charlie Hebdo massacre called Forbidden Stories. And this is really interesting thing that I think speaks to the thing that we need to do to reorient all work, which is to lift up the power of networks. So as journalists are being attacked everywhere around the world, as they're being brutalized, imprisoned, in jail, particularly for pursuing stories about maladministration and corruption against people like, I don't know, Isabel de Santos, for instance. Forbidden stories takes up their cause. Like, for example, there was an extraordinarily courageous reporter in Malta who was following a thread on corruption. She was assassinated. She got into a car one day, car blew up. I'm sure we all know this story. And there was the expectation by the corrupt authoritarians that that was the end of the story. But Richard Lorat and Forbidden Stories did this extraordinary thing where they tapped into a global network of investigative journalists, and secretly, silently, over the course of 6 months, they decided to pick up her investigation and her reporting, and they came out with an expose that blew up politics in Malta, led to the farewell of the Prime Minister, the resignation of the Prime Minister in Malta, and has upended the politics and has opened up a can of worms on this question of corruption and democracy. So they are showing, by their example, that when a journalist falls down, either jailed, or brutalized, or killed, that the network, global network, will be there to pick up the standard and to pick up her keyboard and to make sure that the message does not die. And that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And I think that we need to be replicating, scaling the power of network in that way, because, you know, the authoritarians are taking lessons from one another, so we ought to be as well.
I love that, Patrick. Tasha, what about you? What's inspiring and what do we need to know about?
Well, I'm very lucky because I get to report on people who inspire me a lot of the time, but also, just to make it even more effective, I've been reporting a book for the last couple of years on imaginative political projects. So I've been talking to people who just, who give me hope, starting from where the book is going to start is on an organic farm in Palestine. All these young people who are imagining a different relationship to land, who are actually creating a different relationship to the food they eat. And then my daughter went and volunteered at this farm for a month last summer, so she inspires me too for many reasons in addition to that one. So I am daily or at least weekly exposed to the possibility of a different future.
I cannot wait for your book. Thank you. Maria?
Oh my Lord. So the last 3 years have been about anger management. And what's inspiring, the big question we're dealing with in Rappler is I think the big question every news group should be dealing with, every civil society group, which is what does civic engagement, how do movements grow, how do we come together in the age of social media when we are being literally splintered apart, right? And I think I want you to see this as clearly as we do. Think about it like this. This former KGB chairman who used to head the Soviet Union, his name's Yuri Andropov, talked about how disinformatia is like taking drugs, or drug war, taking drugs. You take it once or twice, you're unchanged, right? You can go right back to being who you are. But if you take it all the time, you become a completely changed person. So this, regardless of everything else going on around, think about our ecosystems like this. There's so much drugs pumped into it, and we first must stop the drugs and then rehabilitate all the people who have become drug addicts. And the irony of all of this, of course, is I'm telling you about this Russian talking about drug use when we're in the middle of a drug war that has killed, human rights groups say, tens of thousands of people in 3 years, right? So how do we rehabilitate all of us? You talked about us all being in the same thing. We've been taking drugs. Disinformation is part of our information ecosystem. How do news groups adapt to this? Well, in Rappler, we decided in the age of disinformation, in the age of social media, in the battle for truth, journalists are activists, and we embrace that. It's time to fight the battle, and that fundamentally changes the way you do journalism.
All right, can we get a huge round of applause? You are my inspiration. You know, 100%. So now let's go to some questions. Okay, I will wait for a microphone to float up to someone. I'm going to let you choose. I'm going to let the mic handlers choose, because that way I won't be blamed for anything. It's the coward's way out.
For each one of you, or one of you, on topic.
Do you mind just standing up?
Yeah,
so I can
yeah,
see
for
for a
sure.
second?
For each one of you, or one of you, on the topic, just the first word, truth, epistemologically, dealing with knowledge, ontology, dealing with metaphysics, and moral ethics. What is objective truth? Can you taste and touch it? Where is it found? Can you grow it in your party?
Yeah, so basically, is there an objective truth, or is the conceit just a conceit? That's a great question.
Easy. There's no objective truth, right? But what we can agree on are the facts. Your truth is yours, my truth is mine, but the facts are what holds us together, so we can begin a discussion about the kind of world we want to create.
I think there's shared reality, and I think what is really dangerous to politics is the destruction of shared reality.
Yes.
Right? And that's what terrifies me, for example, about watching the impeachment hearings, is that you actually can't understand what you're seeing in the framework of a shared reality, right? There's one reality, there's another reality. You can decipher what you're seeing according to the frame of one or the other, but there's no shared one.
What they said.
And also, just that thing I mentioned, the view from somewhere, that's a great exploration of that. Okay, dealer's choice.
I think it's fair to say that due to the nature of your work, you guys have to deal with difficult and inherently dangerous topics. So you probably developed a lot of experience in initiating difficult conversations. So what would be your advice to regular people who want to start a conversation about a difficult topic, and how should they lead it so that it becomes a constructive discussion and not make it feel like it's a personal attack?
If I could just answer quickly, I would say that there's a wonderful power that we all have that we underutilize, and it's the power of inquiry. Too many debates start with declarative statements instead of questions. Back in the day, when I used to have to knock on doors to go into people's living rooms to persuade them of the challenges that my community faced and to get their solidarity on those challenges, I would often begin with some questions to understand where that person was in their life and how they were engaging with the metrics that I found to be oppressive. And so beginning with questions for me was always the most powerful act of empathy and humility. And I think that's a thing that we just don't do enough in our political discourse.
I would add that having a shared task is really helpful. If you're, raising a kid together or cleaning up a hallway together, and you actually have to share physical space in which you discuss whatever it is you need to discuss, you're going to have to come to a consensus of some sort, right? And that's where I actually want to second Maria, that's where I think that social media is really dangerous, is that it creates the illusion of having a political conversation while not requiring you to stay in the room, right? Like the motivation of social media is actually to have your say and slam the door. Right? Whereas in a real political conversation, you are stuck in the room, and your motivation is to make the temperature in the room more agreeable to everybody.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. From Asia's largest Roman Catholic nation, right?
And I'll just chime in, is I spent a lot of my career talking to people who didn't particularly want to talk to me. And so I didn't start with the questions. You know, I just listened, sometimes for 20 minutes, half an hour, listened to them talk about their lives, their families, and that gave me context for how I asked questions that I was going to ask anyway, but the how came out of the listening. All right, next person.
Hello, my name is Dina, and I'm Middle Eastern, I'm Lebanese, and to me, the age of fake news is actually dates back a long time. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, I was young enough to watch CNN and see absolutely wrong news. And I watched how Iraq, another beloved Arab country, and when CNN was embedded with the American army. So I felt some privilege of you all on this stage. I know not all of you are American, but there's a privilege of how you talk about how fake the news is now, how victims you are. And there is, although Maria and Masha talk about the global citizen, there is a lack of inclusion of the global citizen. Nowadays, the revolution in Lebanon against the most corrupt regime we have, the revolution in Iraq against the regime, as well as the occupation, the revolutions in Chile, in Argentina, and Bolivia, are bound by three things: bad economy, young people, and the social media. So you cannot, the social media has been our voice, and there is something lacking here. I hope that you shed some light on it.
No, I'm grateful for that. Happy?
Yeah, I think that you probably would get a lot of head nods and amens here from us. I think that there's something that distinguishes that era from this one, and that is, I think that at that time there was at least the opportunity to have choice in information that is almost non-existent now with the consolidation of media and in the way in authoritarian spaces where oligarchs are buying the media for their government friends. I'm heartened to see the demonstrations that have occurred in places like Lebanon, pushing back against these instincts. But I'll tell you, you identify us as Americans. As somebody whose family comes from Haiti and who's born in the Congo, I was always struck when I emigrated to the U.S. as a child. I was always struck by the political narratives that my classmates would take up based on what they were receiving in the news, and what I understood to be a set of facts and truth because of the places that I had come from, the information and the brutality that I had experienced. And more often than not, that brutality had a relationship with the perversion of American power overseas. And I understood there was a story that my classmates were being told and a reality that I had experienced. And I could only experience the news in America at that time as propaganda. It was utterly propagandistic. It still is. So there's not disagreement with you on that score. I would just say that there was more of a pluralistic media environment than exists now.
I would say I come from a country where our war for independence is known as the Spanish-American War. So I completely understand and empathize. At the same time, we're at a place right now where all of our different realities can't move into a space where we can effectively discuss and find a solution. And obviously, from what Patrick said, right, it's extremely complex, but the countries that you mentioned also have the same problems with social media. Having said that, I don't want to throw out social media. Rappler exists because the reason we grew so fast from 2012 to 2015, we grew, in a year and a half, we became the third top online news site because of Facebook. We're very frenemies with Facebook. We're still their partner. We're partners, but we call a spade a spade.
Yeah, and I would just say that, I grew up in a family of journalists. My dad and mom met at Syracuse's communications program, and before I was born, my mom worked as a reporter in Zambia. She's American, my dad's Zimbabwean. And I essentially was told to have like a split gaze, where the mainstream news was incredibly important, but it would never accurately describe the world to me. So it was up to us to seek out information from Southern Africa, and during my childhood was the struggle for independence in Zimbabwe, so that was critical. It was up to us to read the Ebony and the Jet and the Baltimore Afro-American as well as, but I think that your point is incredibly well taken, and I think it's part of this questioning of, you know, America has never really wanted to talk about how propagandistic our news industry has been throughout its history, but it is, you know, it has served some but not others. But I think the key is not to withdraw from media, it is to more deeply engage and to become your own primary source and to seek knowledge. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a conservative woman who works in climate policy, and I've been subject to a strange, bizarre degree of both online and in-person harassment. I've appreciated what each one of you has said about what inspires you, about what maintains your joy, and applauding the courage of people who speak up, especially women, minorities, and people of color. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on concrete policy approaches, things that we need to do as a society to shut down the deterrent of this harassment, because it's real. It is very real, and it is, you know, deterring people from participating in the public square.
The easy one, free speech is not, so, you know, the platforms will say this is a free speech issue, right? This isn't a free speech issue. Free speech is being used to stifle free speech. Your speech, our speech. If the populist narrative doesn't fit it, you're pounded to silence. There's several solutions that are there, and they are policy solutions, not just with Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, right? The easy one, I was just telling Patrick, like, we've been looking for a solution for 3 years, our team. And one solution, and this came out of the DLD conference in Munich a few weeks ago, is to actually legislate that we own our data. And so if there was data portability from these platforms, they would have far more incentive to keep us safe, right? Because if you get pounded to silence on one huge platform, you can take all your data and move it to, like, the new one that, is it the Wikipedia founder? Right, Jimmy Wales is setting up, right? So the solution has got to be multilateral, because the tech platforms are saying, well, we don't know what to do, or we're doing our best. Now, I'm going to let them talk about it after, but it's not enough.
I agree, and you know, I think that we have to face the fundamental problem, which is that we have entrusted our public sphere to profit-making corporations. And you know, we've done this for a very long time. There was a short, and I would argue anomalous period, when that worked reasonably well. Right? It just happened to be a time in the aftermath of World War II when private business needed enough advertising space that it could serve as a vehicle for local news, and we could have a semblance of a political conversation in, as an externality of business making money. Then we saw consolidation of those businesses. We saw the disappearance of the need for that much advertising space. We saw the total deregulation of media, and then we saw the emergence of technology behemoths, right, who claim not to be media at all. And we can't ask them to self-regulate. We can't put pressure on them to self-regulate. Their ultimate motivation is to make money, which is at odds with providing a political environment. Right? And so we have to rethink the whole thing fundamentally. Right? We can't entrust our public sphere to a profit-making corporation that is actually accountable to one person as it happens.
I'm sorry, what's your name?
Sarah Hunt.
Sarah, thank you for your question, Sarah, and thank you for having the the courage to be a conservative woman working in climate space. Thank you for having the courage to stand up in this room and self-identify in that way. You know, Sarah, there are no easy answers to this. I will say that one of the things that we do need to do is to find ways to push past the power of anonymity that's granted on the social media platforms, and that's why it makes it kind of easy to crowdsource bullying, crowdsource violence, and kind of crowdsource hatred. So I think we do need to do everything that we can to eliminate that kind of anonymity. We have to reclaim a different sense of what the public square is, because we don't allow that kind of violence in the physical public square. So why wouldn't we allow it in the virtual public square, which is increasingly becoming the primary environment that we litigate our politics into? If that's some really tough questions. If, you know, not far from here, out in San Francisco, in their city council in San Francisco, they were able to stand up and legislate against the use of facial recognition in policing, because they understood the disparities that was driving. So if at the municipal level, the sub-federal level, you can have municipalities that take up tough choices like that about how tech is distorting democratic practice and outcome. Certainly, again, at the sub-federal level, we should be able to have these kinds of conversations and take up legislation in city councils, in state senates, and state assemblies that will go right at the question of hate speech, that will eventually condition a different kind of behavior in our national politics and our national law on these issues. So I would find ways to test legislation at the local level. Maria before said that Putin's Russia was the first one to use these tools in a particular way. That's not a coincidence, given that Putin was an agent of intelligence. They recognize that all social media is really an intelligence tool to gather data and to then weaponize that data in a way that makes your enemies consume themselves. That's what's happening to you online. And I think there are some strategies that we can take on at the local level to reinvigorate a sense of the physical public square and give it some representation online that can push back against that behavior.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of a very stimulating and pleasantly not depressing discussion. I just wanted to read something from Maria from 1,000 Cuts, and this gave it the title. What we're seeing is death by 1,000 cuts in our democracy, and when you have enough of these cuts, you're so weakened that you will die. But the upside is that everyone on this panel is doing the work of deep repair of our democracy, repair of our social system, and it is so inspiring for me to be here with you. Patrick, Masha, Maria, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sundance.